Welcome to the Lebanon Ideas Forum video series, featuring politicians, activists, entrepreneurs, and more from Lebanon and across its extensive diaspora. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. Today, we feature a conversation between one of America's top Lebanon experts, Ambassador David Hale, who served as ambassador to Lebanon, Jordan, and Pakistan, and is now Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow here at the Wilson Center, and Mark Daou, one of the newly elected members of parliament in the May parliamentary elections that took place in Lebanon, representing one of the Druze seats in Aley. Mark is a lecturer in media studies at the American University of Beirut and founder and CEO of a public relations firm. He surprised many by defeating Talal Arsalan, who is one of the establishment politicians that thousands of activists stand against. In fact, Mark's entry to parliament comes from his activism. He's co-founder of Taqaddum, one of the parties set up in 2019 by activists and members of civil society in light of the protests that took place then. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. Ambassador Hale, over to you to kick off the discussion with Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Marissa, for the introduction and for bringing us together. And Mark, thank you for joining us and talking to our audience. And congratulations. Let me start off by offering hearty congratulations for your electoral victory. We know how hard it is for an independent to win, and I'd like to hear more about how you came about doing that. There's so much to talk about in terms of what's in the news, the port explosion, border demarcation talks that we're trying to advance with Israel. But the larger questions of the future of Lebanon, the political decisions ahead of you in Parliament today, the financial reforms and other things that are needed to take Lebanon out of this dire condition, I think are topics we're going to want to dig into. You have many, many friends, Lebanese people, many friends in America who are eager to help, but successive administrations have conditioned assistance to those reforms. So that's a very important theme for us. But let me start by just asking you how you won and against the odds, and what advice do you have to colleagues who may want to follow in your footsteps in the future?
Thank you first for the invitation and for the opportunity to address this audience in particular, and especially with Ambassador David on the call as well. That would be a challenge in itself. So I'll start off with what happened. Basically, I decided to run for elections somewhere around 2012. And ever since, I've been working grassroots, door to door, talking to people, taking local causes, challenging local municipalities, continuously trying to mobilize organizations and local groups. And I think that snowballed eventually with the right political atmosphere. So we started off with a very local protest in 2013 around the biggest landfill in Lebanon, in Niamey. That mobilized into an outright, the Use Think movement known in 2015, which I played a bigger and bigger role through, which then spilled over into municipal elections in Beirut, Madinati, and Shuwaifat, and other areas within the Aley district, which I ran for. And then from there, it even escalated more. I ran for parliament in 2018, had a good result, a fair distribution of votes across communities. So that was a good base to pick up from. A year after 2019 happened, and then things just skyrocketed. The organization, the interest, people breaking away from traditional parties and leaders have no answers to the current crisis that the people were going through. And that escalation helped build a big momentum. Definitely the powerful interventions of the media in Lebanon built a lot into that, because Lebanon is highly focused on traditional TVs, so the three major TVs. But I think one more thing is there is a generational gap in terms of political narrative, in terms of organization and organizational capabilities, and most of all in terms of communication tools. And that's where I think my background in media studies and public relations really helped a lot. When you're challenging incumbents whose family's been in the business since 1926 and losing the seat close to 100 years, with a family tradition claimed to be hundreds of years back. I think what really changed is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the ability to connect with the new voters. So what happened in 2019, I think, triggered political interest in that young generation that had low turnout, and suddenly all of them were flooding the polls. And the last thing is, I think, the cross-sectarian reach of the political narrative that we were talking about, because at the end, the tally of my votes, I got about 11,600 plus votes. My votes in Aley in specific were about 6,000 Druze, 5,000 Christians, and other Sunnis and Shiites within the region. So that big split reflected that the political narrative was capable of addressing multiple communities in a district that was heavily split and saw the worst scenes of the civil war in terms of genocidal killings and others. So bridging that gap was a big vote of trust in that people are willing to move beyond traditional civil war parties, whether in their symbolism, their narrative, or the relevance of re-engaging the audience with the historic stories of we died for you, we protected for you. So I think all of these, if we pile them on top of each other, are the media, the generational, and the political narrative tools. To also add one point, I think the district I was running for, which is predominantly, again, Druze and Christian, are evidently and very clearly positioned in politics as anti-Hezbollah, the Iranian influence in Lebanon, or the Syrian regime. And given that our stances are not lukewarm on that, we're very clear-cut, whether myself and some other candidates on the list. I think that gave us a big boost because people understood that those people have clear positions on politics. We're not taking a risk on someone who's claiming they can fix a generator or bring electricity or some of the basic services. So therefore, they noticed that the political challenges are well understood and the positions are clear, along with being present with the people, being part of the daily lives, and all of that. I'll tell you a funny story. For the past 6 months, I've never cut my hair at the same hairdresser. I always continuously move from one village to the other because hairdressers really can deliver a message. So basically, I've been working all the district when it comes, and I can start rating them.
That's fantastic. I mean, what an interesting melding of traditional and the new generational means of communication. That's fantastic. Some of your other independent colleagues didn't do as well, of course, and you got sort of a good news, bad news story. And the good news is you're in Parliament. The bad news is, I suppose, I mean, you tell me that it's awfully challenging to find the kind of support you need to make the changes you have in mind. So maybe you could address that. How are you going to proceed in Parliament, and what do you think is realistically possible for you and others like you to achieve?
So I think we're close to 90 days. In about 4 days, we'll have 90 days in Parliament. I think the biggest challenge is the incumbents or the majority of Parliament is so well entrenched in terms of back offices, knowing the background, knowing how to basically negotiate parliamentary deals, not talking here about corruption or anything, it's just about how the Parliament runs. So there's a track record and an ability to reach an agreement or to negotiate differences, which we don't have because, one, there are no personal relationships. We do not run in similar circles with the majority of the parliamentarians. Our understanding of the process is still not as deep or detailed as they are. Here I'm talking about bylaws, I'm talking about procedures, not to mention that the administrative staff is barely showing up given the challenges of transportation, the cost, and their salaries on Lebanese. On top of that, they are not inclined to be very helpful of the challengers who keep on picking up fights with traditional parties or others. So I'll tell you a small story. There's this tradition of tipping those people who offer you coffee or water or whatever during sessions. So traditional politicians are used to literally tipping everyone as they go in parliament. That gets you even more water than the other guy. So in overall, I think the setup that we have is not prepped as activists to perform fully as parliamentarians in terms of our full potential. So we're playing catch up in basically getting the laws, going to the background of the laws. What we got is about 339 draft laws within the committees. We're 13 to split ourselves up on committees to be able to digest those, build teams of legal experts, constitutional experts, as well as subject matter experts to be able to comprehend the dynamics. And then the kickoff of the lobbying part, I know this is always a big topic in the US, but it is on a smaller scale, but it happens in Lebanon with unions, syndicates, think tanks, and others. They're always reaching out, even embassies or others that have perspectives on issues, and they always come and engage the parliamentarians. So managing all of that pile of work together and building up the team as we go is probably the biggest challenge that we have. And I'll end off with a quick concept. There are two parts to parliamentary work. There's the legislative part and the oversight part. I think a lot of effort is always thrown into the legislative part. And when we went into the Lebanese parliament, we discovered that there's a special committee called the Committee of Unapplied Legislation. So you basically vote on a legislation, but it's never applied because there's a fallacy in the system, or it is impossible to apply it for certain organizational restrictions or positions or others. And this is one of the challenges is you can vote on laws, but it will not necessarily be the game changer all the time. While the oversight part is completely covered, most of the committee sessions that we have are not hearings. They are not challenging the administration or the ministers constantly to perform. So accountability is not as present as we expected in the parliamentary procedures. And I think that would require harder work than legislation because you have to dig up information, you have to access that, prove how that is happening, document it, pick it up in parliament, and then drive the legal as well as the judicial as well as the parliamentary hearings to get things to stop or change or to amend. So I think the heavy part that will take some time for us to start kicking off is the accountability procedures. We already are taking some steps when it comes to preserving the silos and the issue of the non-ending fire and contamination of the city with carbon monoxide and other gases. So these are parts of following up and accountability. The other part of legislation, I'm saying it's easier, both are very challenging, but it's relatively easier because we can find resources, excellent, capable individuals who will advise us on how to best approach and how to tackle the layers of legislation that have been built. So for example, the law on judicial independence has been in committees for 3 to 4 years. It's the capital control law has been there for 3 years. So all of these require us to understand where they started, how it evolved, and how it's moving on, because there's a certain continuity that we need to understand so we don't reinvent the wheel.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's really exciting. And I really appreciate, and I'm sure more importantly, many Lebanese appreciate your focus on oversight. In my experience in Lebanon, accountability and transparency in the governmental system is one of the major issues for so many people, and the starting point, and unfortunately the end point in many instances for finding solutions. So we wish you well with that. Why don't you paint the picture a little bit for us of the next 4 to 6 months, because we know, it's not abnormal, but we're stuck on the government formation question. Obviously, without a government, we can't move forward on reforms very effectively anyway. And then, of course, the big question of the presidency in the fall. So I think we'd all appreciate your perspective on these and what role you see yourself playing in that and others.
Okay. Let's just start with the shortest term thing. Obviously, the people in the current positions of power, the presidencies in Lebanon, the system, as you well might know, are very dominant and very powerful. The signature of any president or speaker controls the entire administration that he runs. So I think the coming 60 days are extremely critical because they will basically end between now and the first week of September. We're technically done with the summer break for Parliament, and we're supposed to go into legislation. We had one extra legislative session, exceptional, that was done. I believe we will have another one for capital controls and some other reforms that are necessary to move forward with the IMF agreement. There is also the issue of the budget, which should come up in the coming 30 days. They've already crossed a lot of that. I'm attending the Finance Committee's work on the budget. So that has progressed, although we're closer to September and we're voting on a budget for 2022, 9 months late, or at least 11 months late. But getting that in is not only relevant for 2022, but it's also a master plan for how to move forward in 2023 with the upcoming budget. So what we're actually debating in text is 2022, but practically we're doing 2023 as we go, because whatever the Ministry of Finance is going to send next in October, as per the Constitution, will be the budget, and it's going to be very similar to what we agree on. So I think we're literally doing 2 budgets in one. So that's coming up in the coming 30 days. The Speaker of the House, Berry, said, we want to get the reforms done before we move on to electing a president. Technically, by the Constitution, 1st of September till the 31st of October, we should turn the parliament into an electoral body, and that can only vote for a president. It seems he's not going to call for the election sessions till the end of September, giving us a window of 30 days. I believe there are 2 reasons for that. The public reason is that we need to get the reforms done, but the insider reason, I believe, is there's no consensus or ability to get a president elected, so they better go and cook that up until it's ready to be executed. And I think the biggest challenge now when we get into October is, will the same exercise that happened 6 years ago when Michel Aoun got elected, there was a void in the presidency for 2 years, 2015 and 16. That void was a disaster for Lebanon. It cost us a financial engineering that was done end of 2015, which basically inflated the bank numbers and sucked all the liquidity from the banks into the central bank through the credit deposit, the CDSs and others, and they bought treasury bills in Lebanese lira and others. So literally the liquidity of the banking system was sucked up by the central bank to sustain the balance of payments and to sustain the currency. So going into a bigger void in the coming 90 days is not gonna bode well for Lebanon, and we no longer have the capability to dig into funds of the people in the commercial banks or the investment banks. So basically, I'm forecasting we're moving forward in the coming 30 days to 2 legislative sessions, one on reforms and new laws, mainly capital control and the revision of bank secrecy. The second is a dedicated session for the budget as per the Constitution. After that, we go into the election sessions. I would assume no president will be elected, not to mention no government will be formed. No presidency till the end of October. I think the last week of October is going to be the 11th hour. At that point, we're going to see if we're going into a void or not. If we go into 1 hour of void, I think that might spill out into a year, because there's no reasoning to pull out between 1 or a year, and that would force a greater international intervention, I guess, or pressure, not to say intervention, but pressure on the different parties to find a solution. but that will also cause a larger deterioration in the socio-economic situation in Lebanon, which would be disastrous. This is why Lebanon is a food security risk country, because we are still importing most of our major grains and imports through subsidies coming from the central bank's reserves or the remaining reserves. And as we are hearing, because we never know the real number given the lack of transparency at the central bank, the numbers have dipped below $7 or $6 billion. So that will not be enough for us to sustain for the coming 2 years. And with no resolution for the economic or financial situation and no stabilization of the currency, this might go southwards even more. So I believe for the coming 2 months, that's the situation. For the coming 3 months, if we build up till the New Year's, then the topic will no longer be about the crippling of the presidency only. It will become about deteriorating economic and humanitarian situation in Lebanon in the thick of winter. So with no imports, because all the energy imports that we do now, whether it's diesel or petrol or others, are all through funds collected, given to the central bank, and then he's importing those funds. He's using the funds he has to import the products. And if he can no longer perform that, that would be a problem. We still subsidize 3 main elements in Lebanon: energy, medicine, and wheat. For bread, the wheat, we got an agreement with the World Bank, which is more like a donation for $150 million. That is enough for about 6 months if the prices remain as high as they are now. So I think this is what we're looking at now. Caretaker government, 31st of October, if there's no president, they will assume what they have. And one important point here is that most decisions, decrees that are happening today, and spending and contractual signatures that are keeping the administration going, require the president's signature. If the president is no longer there, then all 24 ministers will have veto power. If they don't sign, it doesn't work, because the constitution says that presidential prerogatives become joint between all 24 of the cabinet. And therefore nothing will move, and therefore we will not be able to manage or run the administration. And every single minister will literally have the ability to blackmail the entire society to figure out what they want, or to pass one law versus the other, get in political agendas, and we're looking at a hell of a blocked decision-making process. So it's not looking good for the coming 6 months. Electing a president is a necessity, and electing them on time is an absolute urgency. Unfortunately, I think a political compromise between the different parties to reach an agreement without blocking the election of a president is slim. So most probably everyone will go to the edge and then jump, waiting for a solution for the presidential void.
Well, it's good to get your analysis, and even sobering as it is, it sounds realistic to me. Certainly any student of Lebanese history knows that almost every 6 years we face a crisis over the presidency. I hope this time, given the consequences you just outlined, that hopefully solutions can be found. I have more questions, but Marissa, I'm sure you're standing by. Do you have anything you'd like to raise?
I do want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned, Mark, when David asked you about basically the new parliamentarians, the new independents that are now working together and the challenges that you face. If you are playing catch up, it means that you also need more resources, human resources, perhaps training, etc. So what can the United States do through its various government or non-governmental institutions to support the group as a collective, but also as individuals, to strengthen their capacity and help them catch up with the rest of the parliament, essentially?
Good question. Thank you. Honestly, I think it's more an issue of an ecosystem than supporting the 13. The 13 will play a role, but they cannot literally organize all the effort. It's too big of a wish list to do. But alternative media, investigative journalists, think tanks, research centers, university research about topics in Lebanon, the more data and information we get will help a lot. Again, this is a country with limited access to information. We do not have open access to data. There's a law that allows access to information, but the response rate is very slow, especially if public employees are attending 2 days a week, maximum 3 days a week if they live close by. So I think what we're looking at is a national effort to empower entities and organizations that can provide ideas, data, and research that can guide the legislation that we're producing, and investigative journalism, alternative media, and others that are working on transparency for accountability and oversight on governance. So I think and that will filter through to the MPs, because now people have a clear address of people who are willing to pick up a fight, take a statement, and are not contained or linked through the religious, sectarian, pie-splitting exercises that used to happen before. In terms of the parliamentarians directly themselves, creating back offices that can work, building their teams of legislatives and subject matter experts are definitely useful, but there are so many topics and the people are reaching out constantly that I think it's a massive effort to try and contain it into one hierarchical structure that reports directly to the MPs. Now, yes, it would be great to have qualified chiefs of staff, 3-4 experts, weekly meetings, going through the details, summarizing what's happening. But I think that has to grow organically and until it reaches a certain stage. And then the trainings, I think NDI, IRI, and others that they offer would be very helpful also for the teams that we're having, because most of us now are building teams. And like I belong to a party, the Taqaddum Progress Party. So we are building teams. We've got students, we've got experts, we've got others. They're still volunteering, but they all need training and support to be at par with the traditional parties, because I'll tell you another insight that we found. Traditional parties don't hire experts. They literally use the existing people in the administration, or they use those who have served with them in the administration and are now in retirement. So you find a lot of retired public servants working on the political party advisory groups of the traditional parties because of the relationships, the know-how. Those people know the administration. There are a lot of them who are highly qualified. So commissioning those people to try and help us reform, because if we can't say public employees are 100% loyalty to the traditional parties, that is not true. But finding those people, working with them, is something that would be very useful for us.
Well, thank you, Mark. You mentioned Hezbollah earlier on, and attitudes in your district toward Hezbollah. Could you elaborate a little bit on your thinking, particularly how Lebanon and its friends and supporters can create conditions in which Hezbollah is disarmed, as was required by the Taif agreement, but unfortunately never fulfilled?
Yeah. Currently, I think the experience of 2005 till 2008 that was contained by the Doha agreement, basically the confrontational head-on attack on Hezbollah did not pay off, unfortunately, due to the killings, due to the constant flow of supplies from the Syrian regime and the others, which literally undermined the stability of the country. And I think that was reflected after the May 7th onslaught by Hezbollah's arms into the country in Mount Lebanon and others, which unfortunately led to the Doha Accords that institutionalized a bigger violation of the Taif agreement, because now it was all a consensus driven process. There was no elections, and the law that was created at the time, which broke down the 1960 law, was against the perception that we need bigger parties and better systems. If we started with the election in 2009 in proportional elections, I think things would have been a bit different than what we ended up with now. And then in 2010, I think the international pressure, Saad al-Hariri went to Damascus and others. So the head-on confrontation was over with the Syria-Saudi agreements or whatever was the case at the time. So I think now the balance of powers in terms of military and ability to control government is skewed against those opposing Hezbollah. So I think the way we progress with that, one is reformists like ourselves are playing a role outside the traditional sectarian split. So it is harder for Hezbollah to pitch us as March 14th or as a sectarian group challenging the Shiite authority or trying to pull away their power. Of course, the withdrawal of Saad Hariri made this easier for us as well, not harder, because the old positioning of Sunni Shiite with a split in Christian vote is no longer there. So basically we became a challenger that is capable of growth and potential in that sense. And 5 out of the 13 MPs are Sunnis. 3 of the MPs are in West Beirut. So in Tripoli, we have 1. In West Biqa, we have 1. So obviously the gap left by Hariri is allowing us to flourish and allowing us also to fill in gaps. Not to mention that the seats that I won, that Firas Hamdan and Ilyas Jradi in the south won, or Rami Fenj won, were at the expense of Syrian allies, Asad Hardan, Faisal Karami, Talal Arsalan, and the others. So also we were more efficient in hitting targets that are clearly 8th of March aligned than anyone else. So our appeal to the audiences, the ex-Aounist support, the ex-PSP supporters, the ex-Future Movement supporters, even the Shiite opposition in the south, 20,000 plus votes in the South 3rd District with 2 MPs out of 10, 20% turnout. I think those things make a big difference. And I think this is what needs to be built on. If we get accountability into check, and then through that, we expose Hezbollah's total alignment with the regime. And then on the political end, people start realizing that there is a social challenge that can be built on, which is multi-sectarian, changing the dynamics. That would force traditional parties, such as the Lebanese forces or the PSP or others, that tend to position themselves against Hezbollah, but then crack deals whenever the opportunity arrives, like Mihrab or other alliances in parliament. I think that will squeeze them into a corner where they either have to drop that rhetoric or they have to align even further with it. But 2 poles in Lebanon no longer exists. And I think part of the losing pole, which is March 14th, needs to recycle its rhetoric as a reformist rhetoric to appeal again to the population. And I think at that angle, I'll go into some of the issues. I think the IMF package, I'm confident that Hezbollah does not want the IMF package. I believe they are actively working to delay the entire process. I think Birri is aligned with them. They are aligned with the banking sector interests, at least not the interest of the Lebanese depositors and their rights in the banks, but at least they are aligned with the owners of the banks to protect from accountability again. A similar thing happened with the port explosion, undermining accountability. And I think one more additional item is, if we want to put a progressive plan that I believe could be a starting point to challenge Hezbollah besides what we're doing now, is we win universities, we increase the generational gap, where we are winning the base, the younger Druze, Sunnis, Christians, and Shiites, because that is a possibility that we can run. We can appeal to that. We are present, we are active, we can organize. That spills over to syndicates. That allows us to do major challenges along municipal lines when the municipal elections happen next May. I'll add on the political front, I think having that movement and opposition would reignite interest of the international community, probably the Arab world as well, to come and kind of empower those youth, their activities, their exposure in the media, their access even to funding to do events. We couldn't lobby or do events in Saudi or the UAE, although we could fundraise a lot there. If our political movements are welcomed, then we will definitely be able to do that. Aligning a lot of the expat population, which was decisive in the election, we can do that. We have the credibility, we have the network, and I think we're capable even technically to maintain that. That is another part of building that network that we need to challenge Hezbollah. We all know they money launder, they transfer. I once visited a European country. There are 24 religiously affiliated organizations with Hezbollah that teach the Quran, teach Arabic language, create their own activities and schools, and that give religious advisories. I believe all of those are fronts that transfer money somewhere else. Two of them were closed because they traded in agricultural nitrates. We know where that goes to. So I think that would work. And the last thing I'll finish off with, if we, the demarcation you mentioned, if that is concluded successfully and pinned to Ras al-Naoura, to exactly the land point that it should be pinned to, then the blue line can be drawn straight to Ras al-Naoura, and we would have started drawing the border, the land borders. I think that would be the second step, and the framework for negotiations that was agreed on for the maritime border actually mentions, and I'm sure you're the expert on that because you were there all the time, it mentions the land borders as well. So I think that is a good starting point to start diffusing the pretext for the use of weapons that haven't been used for 16 years, that will not be used probably for the coming 5 to 10 years, hopefully, and then they will become obsolete in the political narrative, at least in Lebanon, except as a theoretical approach in politics, given what has happened in the Arab world, given the amount of Lebanese that work in the Arab world today and that are interacting with states that have normalized relations with Israel. So I think borders, maritime border, pressure on the land borders, and from then on, I think things will start changing as oil and gas money is coming in. There are reasons to protect that. I think that is how we can start containing, going back to the famous containment strategy. It is, we need to win on economics. We need to win on mobilizing human resources that are more attached to their freedom, their ability to express their opinions, the way of life as they know it, especially in the Western and Arab world, and then try to counterbalance the influence of Iranian money and religious dogma that is being taught by Hezbollah.
Well, thank you, Mark. Very sophisticated analysis and prescription for dealing with this terrible problem. I think I only have time for one brief question and maybe hopefully a short answer, but what can we do in America to help? You know, we're supporting the Army and the internal security forces. We're working on the border demarcation issues. We're conditioning our aid. What else can we do? Or would we do something differently in your opinion?
I would say waivers for transfers and donations to NGOs working in Lebanon directly through expats. The biggest challenge we're facing now is there is no one living abroad that's willing to transfer money to Lebanon. Like a whitelist versus a blacklist will also be very helpful, because then the international banking system and others would go easy on supporters and donors. We cannot live off donations in cash when someone comes for a Christmas break or an Easter break or an Adha break. So we need to be able to connect with our audience that has financial capabilities. We will not trade in cigarettes or money laundering like Hezbollah does. So we need clear channels to be able to mobilize resources. Two is the ability to move around the Arab world or the US or others to link with that expat population. to engage them because their numbers are growing, 1.5 million passport holders, and those people are the middle class, they are the capable ones. And when we pick up speed later on, these are the people who will start investing in startups or outsourcing their work into Lebanon because they have a emotional as well, probably as an economic know-how of how to run it. Third, I think, yes, the Lebanese army and supporting the Lebanese army is crucial, not only because of the role that it plays, but because of its symbolism as well. I believe it is a very important institution, and I hope that that institution stays away from politics completely, even presidential seats or otherwise, because we've had 3 army chiefs in a row and it didn't make a difference. So I think moving forward, it's good to see that the internal security forces as well as the army are kept intact, because there is one thing that will help us sustain things and apply laws is the ability of the internal security forces as well as the Lebanese army to perform. We will not be able, as I mentioned before, and very briefly, I know I tend to elaborate, but when we decide on laws, if we don't have the means to apply them, we will not be able to do anything. So the internal security forces, the Lebanese army, are the major tools to apply some of the most critical reforms and recovery that we need to do. Thank you.
Fantastic, Mark. Or Marissa.
Thank you so much, Mark and David, for this discussion. I guess to wrap this up, the one thing that I want to ask you, Mark, is how do you keep the hope? You have so many monumental challenges that you elaborated on very eloquently. How do you keep the hope moving forward?
Very simple. I have one country and I'm staying here for it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Again, Ambassador Hale, for moderating this discussion with MP Mark Daou, and we look forward to continuing the analysis and the discussions on Lebanon through the Lebanon Ideas Forum at the Wilson Center. Thank you.